My brother's text message glowed on my phone screen at 11:47 p.m. Sis, I need you to co-sign tomorrow. Just a formality for the business loan. You won't be responsible for anything, I promise. I stared at those words in my darkened bedroom, something cold settling in my stomach despite Marcus's reassurance. By the time I discovered what that signature really meant, I'd already lost everything I'd spent 15 years building. But that night, exhausted from a double shift at the hospital and trusting my only sibling, I simply texted back, "Okay, what time?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of the signing, I met Marcus at Prestige Capital Solutions, a gleaming office building in downtown Charlotte that screamed legitimacy. My brother looked every inch the successful entrepreneur in his tailored suit, confident smile lighting up his face as he greeted me in the marble lobby. Marcus had always been the charming one in our family, the golden child who could talk his way into or out of anything. I was the practical one, the nurse who worked nights at Presbyterian Hospital, who'd bought a modest townhouse through careful saving, who balanced her checkbook to the penny. "Thank you so much for doing this, Elena," Marcus said, wrapping me in a hug that smelled of expensive cologne. "The investors just need to see that I have family support. It's purely symbolic. You know how these finance guys are about optics." I followed him to the 11th floor where a receptionist directed us to a conference room. The loan officer, a man named Jeffrey Brennan with silver-streaked hair and an expensive watch, greeted us warmly. He laid out paperwork across the glossy table, his movements practiced and efficient. "Ms. Vasquez, your brother is about to do something remarkable," Brennan said, his tone professionally enthusiastic. "The tech logistics platform he's developing has incredible potential. We're excited to be part of this journey." "What exactly am I signing?" I asked, scanning the dense paragraphs of legal text. My nursing training had taught me to read carefully, to question, to verify. But I was running on 4 hours of sleep after a brutal shift, and the legal jargon swam before my eyes. "Standard co-signature documentation," Brennan explained smoothly. "Because this is a new business venture, we require a secondary party as additional security. But given Marcus's projections and the contracts he's already secured, we don't anticipate any issues. This is really just procedural." Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Elena, I wouldn't ask if there was any real risk. The company already has 3 major contracts lined up. This loan is just bridge financing until those payments come through. 60 days, tops, and the loan will be completely paid off from business revenue. And if something goes wrong?" I pressed, my instincts still whispering warnings despite their reassurances. "Then the business assets cover it," Marcus said quickly. "The equipment, the intellectual property, everything. You're not putting up your personal assets. I'd never ask you to risk what you've worked for." Brennan nodded in agreement. "The loan is secured against the business entity. Your role as co-signer is simply to demonstrate family confidence in the venture. It's quite common in startup financing." I wanted to believe them. Marcus was my little brother, the kid I'd helped raise after our parents divorced. He'd been there for me through my own struggles, through my messy breakup with my ex-fiancé, through the grueling years of nursing school when I'd worked 2 jobs to pay tuition. Family helped family. That's what we did. I signed the documents where Brennan indicated, my signature looking small and insignificant on the official papers. Marcus signed as well, beaming with excitement about his business prospects. We took photos together in the conference room, Marcus posting them on social media with captions about new beginnings and family support. "I'm taking you to lunch to celebrate," Marcus insisted as we left the building. "The good Italian place you love." Over pasta at Maggiano's, Marcus painted vivid pictures of his company's future. The logistics software would revolutionize supply chain management. He had meetings with potential investors lined up. The 3 contracts he'd mentioned would bring in enough revenue to expand operations within the year. "You're going to be so proud of me, sis," he said, raising his wine glass. "This is just the beginning." I clinked my glass against his, pushing aside the lingering unease. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe years of seeing the worst outcomes in the emergency room had made me unnecessarily suspicious of good things. The first 3 months passed quietly. Marcus would text occasionally with updates about meetings and progress. He seemed busy, energized, living the entrepreneur dream. I went back to my routine of 12-hour shifts, hiking on my days off, the comfortable rhythm of my carefully constructed life. Then came the first phone call. I was restocking supplies in the trauma bay when my cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Normally I'd let it go to voicemail during my shift, but something made me step into the hallway to answer. "Is this Elena Vasquez?" A woman's voice, professionally neutral but with an edge that immediately put me on alert. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Jennifer Hayes from Prestige Capital Solutions. I'm calling regarding account number 74392. We've been unable to reach Marcus Vasquez, and the payment due last week hasn't been received." My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, what payment?" I co-signed as a formality. The business was supposed to handle all payments. "Ms. Vasquez, as co-signer, you share equal responsibility for this debt. The payment of $4,200 is now 17 days overdue. We need to arrange immediate payment to avoid further penalties." $4,000? For a monthly payment? The room seemed to tilt slightly. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "I was told this was just symbolic, that the business revenues would cover everything. I understand that may have been your expectation, but legally, your signature makes you equally liable for this debt. I have your co-signer agreement right here. Perhaps you should speak with Mr. Vasquez about the business situation, but in the meantime, we need to resolve this overdue payment." I ended the call after promising to look into it, my hands shaking as I tried to focus on my patients. During my break, I called Marcus. His phone went straight to voicemail. I texted him. "Got a call from the loan company. What's going on?" No response. I tried calling again after my shift ended. Still voicemail. I drove to his apartment in South Park, a sleek high-rise that had always seemed beyond his means. The doorman informed me that Marcus had moved out 2 weeks ago. No forwarding address provided. The cold feeling in my stomach intensified into full-blown panic. Over the next week, I pieced together a nightmare. The business address Marcus had given me was a virtual office, just a mail forwarding service. The 3 major contracts he'd mentioned didn't exist. When I finally reached someone at Prestige Capital Solutions willing to discuss details, I learned that the loan wasn't for $60,000 as I'd assumed, but for $240,000. My signature wasn't on a symbolic co-signer document, but on a personal guarantee that made me fully responsible if the business defaulted, which it had. Immediately, Marcus had taken the loan money and vanished. I sat in my townhouse, surrounded by paperwork I'd finally forced myself to read thoroughly, and felt my carefully built life crumbling around me. The monthly payments were $4,200. On my nurse's salary, after mortgage and basic expenses, I barely had $1,500 of discretionary income per month. There was no way I could make these payments. I tried everything. I filed a police report for fraud, but the detective explained that as far as the law was concerned, I had voluntarily signed a legal document. My brother's disappearance was troubling, but I was still legally responsible for the debt. I consulted with a lawyer who confirmed my worst fears. I had signed a personal guarantee. There were no business assets to seize because the business never really existed, and I was on the hook for the full amount. "You could declare bankruptcy," the lawyer suggested gently. "Given the size of this debt versus your income, it might be your best option." Bankruptcy. The word felt like failure, like everything I'd worked for dissolving into nothing. I was 38 years old. I'd spent my entire adult life being responsible, making smart choices, building financial security. And my brother had destroyed it all with a signature I'd made in trust. The collection calls started. Prestige Capital Solutions was polite at first, then increasingly aggressive. They reported the default to credit bureaus. My credit score, which I'd meticulously maintained in the high 700s, plummeted. The mortgage company sent a letter reviewing my account due to the credit change. My car insurance rates increased. A credit card I'd had for 12 years was suddenly closed. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, working myself to exhaustion, but it barely made a dent in the mounting debt. The loan company added late fees, penalty interest, and collection costs. What had started as $240,000 had somehow ballooned to $268,000 within 4 months. I was drowning and I couldn't see any way to the surface. 6 months after signing that document, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot after another grueling shift, staring at a letter from a collection agency. Prestige Capital Solutions had sold my debt to Retrieval Financial Services, a company with a reputation for aggressive collection tactics. The letter threatened legal action, wage garnishment, and property liens if I didn't contact them immediately to arrange payment. I felt hollowed out, too exhausted even to cry. How had I been so stupid? How had I not seen through Marcus's lies? More importantly, where was he, and how could he have done this to his own sister? My phone rang. Another unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, couldn't face another collection call. But something made me pick up. Elena Vasquez? A woman's voice, but different from the collector's.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Younger, with an undertone of urgency rather than aggression. Yes, I said wearily. My name is Rachel Kim. I'm a financial fraud investigator. I've been looking into Prestige Capital Solutions and your brother's loan. I believe you were deliberately targeted in a scheme that involves multiple victims. Can we meet? For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. When and where? We met at a coffee shop near the hospital the next morning. Rachel Kim was in her early 30s, professionally dressed, with a leather portfolio that she opened to reveal extensive documentation. Ms. Vasquez, you're not alone, she began without preamble. I've identified at least 7 other co-signers on similar loans through Prestige Capital Solutions, all with family members who disappeared after taking the money. The pattern is consistent and deliberate. She showed me files on other victims. A woman in Raleigh whose son had borrowed money for a restaurant that never opened. A man in Asheville whose daughter had needed business capital for a boutique that was never stocked. All had signed co-signer documents that turned out to be personal guarantees for enormous sums. All had family members who vanished after the money was dispersed. This is an organized fraud operation, Rachel explained. Prestige Capital Solutions isn't a legitimate lender. They're facilitating these loans specifically to create debt-trapped co-signers. The borrowers are either knowing participants in the scheme or being manipulated themselves. You think Marcus knew? The possibility that my brother had deliberately betrayed me felt worse somehow than the financial devastation. I don't know yet, Rachel admitted. Some of the borrowers appear to be willing participants, effectively selling out their family members for a payout. Others seem to have been manipulated or coerced. What I do know is that Jeffrey Brennan, the loan officer you met with, has facilitated 43 of these suspicious loans in the past 2 years. She pulled out a recorded conversation, tapping her phone screen. This is from another victim, who recorded a call with Brennan after the fraud became apparent. Brennan's voice emerged from the speaker, stripped of its earlier professional warmth. The contract is legal and binding. Your family members' financial difficulties aren't our concern. You signed the guarantee, you're responsible for the debt. If you can't pay, we'll take legal action to seize assets. It's quite simple. Rachel stopped the recording. He's done this dozens of times. Prestige Capital Solutions structures these loans to appear legitimate, while building in clauses that make them almost impossible to challenge legally. By the time victims realize what's happened, the borrowers have disappeared and the co-signers are trapped. What can I do? I asked, hope and desperation warring in my voice. First, don't declare bankruptcy yet. That's exactly what they want because it prevents you from pursuing legal action later. Second, I need you to help me build a case. Every detail you can remember about the signing, every communication with Marcus before and after, every document you have. We're working with the FBI and the State Attorney General's office. She handed me her card. This won't be quick, and I can't promise specific outcomes. But you deserve to know the truth about what happened, and these people need to be stopped before they do this to anyone else. Over the next 3 weeks, I gave Rachel everything I had. Every text message from Marcus, photos from the signing, my copies of the loan documents. I walked her through the entire timeline, from Marcus's initial request to the moment I'd realized how completely I'd been deceived. Rachel introduced me to 2 other victims. Sharon Delgado, whose brother had disappeared after a similar scheme, and Patricia Chan, whose nephew had vanished with loan money supposedly for a tech startup. We formed an unlikely support group, 3 women whose lives had been upended by family betrayal and financial fraud. The worst part isn't even the money, Sharon said during one of our meetings at Patricia's house. It's feeling like an idiot for trusting someone you loved. I understood exactly what she meant. The financial devastation was crushing, but the emotional wound cut deeper. How could Marcus have done this? Had he ever really cared about me, or had I just been a potential mark all along? Rachel's investigation accelerated. She discovered that Prestige Capital Solutions had connections to a larger fraud network operating across 3 states. Jeffrey Brennan was one of several loan officers recruiting borrowers and co-signers for these schemes. Some borrowers like Marcus had disappeared with the money. Others had been found and claimed they'd been manipulated, told the loans were legitimate, and that co-signers wouldn't actually be held responsible. 8 months after I'd signed that document, Rachel called with significant news. The FBI is raiding Prestige Capital Solutions tomorrow morning. They have enough evidence for charges against the company principals and several of the loan officers, including Brennan. More importantly, they've found Marcus. My heart lurched. Where? Scottsdale, Arizona. Living under his own name in a condo he purchased with cash. The FBI arrested him this morning on federal fraud charges. I had to sit down. Marcus arrested. My little brother, who I'd helped with homework and driven to soccer practice, who'd hugged me at our mother's funeral and promised we'd always take care of each other, was being charged with defrauding me and others. What happens now? I managed to ask. The legal process will take time. But there's something else you should know. We found communications between Marcus and Brennan that date back 14 months before your loan signing. They were planning this specifically, discussing how to approach you, what to say to overcome your likely objections. The room seemed to lose oxygen. He targeted me deliberately? I'm sorry, Elena. The evidence suggests Marcus was a knowing participant from the beginning. He received $40,000 as his cut of your loan. Similar arrangements with other borrowers we've identified. After hanging up, I sat motionless in my living room, trying to process this new layer of betrayal. It wasn't a desperate mistake or a bad decision that spiraled out of control. Marcus had calculated, planned, and executed a scheme to destroy my financial life for $40,000. The rage that had been building beneath my exhaustion and grief finally surfaced. I'd spent months blaming myself, questioning every decision, wondering how I'd been so blind. But I'd been deliberately deceived by someone who knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, who had years of trust to exploit. I called Rachel back. Whatever you need from me for this case, I'm in. Testimony, evidence, anything. I want him to face consequences. I was hoping you'd say that, Rachel replied. The federal prosecutor wants to meet with you and the other co-signer victims. They're building a case that goes beyond Marcus to the entire fraud operation. The meeting with Assistant U.S. Attorney David Park took place in a federal building downtown, in a conference room that reminded me uncomfortably of where I'd signed the original documents. Park was in his 40s, with a reputation for aggressive prosecution of financial crimes. Thank you all for coming, he began, addressing me, Sharon, Patricia, and 3 other co-signer victims Rachel had identified. What happened to you was not your fault. You were victims of a sophisticated fraud scheme that exploited family relationships and trust to create what we call debt hostages. People trapped by obligations they never truly understood they were accepting. He outlined the case they were building. Prestige Capital Solutions had created loans designed to fail, targeting co-signers with stable incomes and assets. The borrowers received cash payouts for recruiting their family members, and then either disappeared or claimed they'd also been deceived. The loan terms included clauses that made early repayment difficult and heavily penalized any defaults. Collection agencies in on the scheme would purchase the defaulted loans and pursue co-signers aggressively, often using tactics that bordered on harassment. The criminal charges include wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, Park explained. We're going after everyone involved, from the company principals down to individual loan officers. But I want you to understand that the criminal case is separate from your civil remedies. What does that mean for our debt? Sharon asked, voicing what we were all thinking. If we can prove the loans were part of a criminal enterprise, there are legal mechanisms to void them or significantly reduce them. but I can't make promises about specific outcomes. What I can tell you is that by cooperating with this prosecution, you're helping prevent this from happening to other people and potentially creating pathways to resolve your own situations. We all agreed to cooperate fully. Over the following months, I gave depositions, provided evidence, and prepared for what might eventually be trial testimony. The process was grueling, requiring me to relive the betrayal repeatedly, but it also provided something I'd lost: a sense of agency. I wasn't just a victim drowning in debt. I was fighting back. The media coverage started when the federal indictments were announced. Multi-state fraud ring targeted family co-signers, read the headline in the Charlotte Observer. My name wasn't mentioned specifically, but as one of the victims cooperating with prosecutors, I received calls from journalists wanting my story. I declined them all. This wasn't about publicity. It was about justice and hopefully, eventually freedom from the crushing debt that had consumed my life. Marcus's arrest and the exposure of the fraud scheme didn't immediately solve my financial problems. I was still receiving collection calls, still facing the possibility of legal action from Retrieval Financial Services. But Rachel connected me with a lawyer specializing in fraud cases who filed motions to stay any collection actions pending the criminal proceedings. This is going to be a long fight, the lawyer Susan Ortega warned me. Even if the criminal case succeeds, unwinding these loan obligations will require separate civil actions. We're talking years, not months. I'd already lost so much time to this nightmare. What were a few more years if it meant eventual resolution? The preliminary hearings revealed more disturbing details about the scope of the fraud. Prestige Capital Solutions had facilitated over 300 questionable loans, totaling $93 million. Many borrowers had disappeared. Some had been found living under assumed names in other states. A few, like Marcus, had been arrested. When I finally saw Marcus in court for his arraignment, I barely recognized him. He looked smaller somehow, diminished in his orange jumpsuit, his usual confidence replaced by something that might have been shame or might have just been fear of prison. Our eyes met briefly across the courtroom. I felt nothing but a cold, distant anger. The prosecutor approached me after the hearing. He wants to talk to you. Through his lawyer. Says he wants to explain. I don't want his explanation, I replied immediately. I understand. But his lawyer indicated he might be willing to provide additional information about the fraud network in exchange for a plea deal. Information that could help void or reduce your loan obligation and help other victims. I considered this carefully. Tell his lawyer I'll consider meeting with him only if it's part of a formal proffer agreement where everything he says can be used in the case. And I want Rachel and Susan present. The meeting was arranged for 2 weeks later, in a federal facility where Marcus was being held pending trial. When they brought him into the interview room, he looked haggard, older than his 35 years. Elena, he started, but I cut him off with a raised hand. I'm not here for apologies or explanations, I said, my voice flat and controlled. I'm here because your lawyer says you have information that might help resolve the damage you caused. If that's not true, we're done. Marcus slumped in his chair. The bravado I remembered completely gone. It's true. I can tell you how the whole operation worked, who else was involved, how they found and recruited people like me. Why? I asked. Why did you do this to me? To us. He was quiet for a long moment. $40,000. That's what they offered me to recruit you. I was in debt from gambling bad investments. They approached me, said it was easy money. Your signature on a piece of paper, you'd never actually be responsible for anything, and I'd walk away with enough to solve my problems. And you believed them? My voice dripped with contempt. I wanted to believe them. By the time I realized what was really happening, that they were going to actually pursue collection against you, I was already in too deep. They had evidence of my involvement. Threatened to expose me if I tried to warn you. So you ran instead. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Marcus said, meeting my eyes for the first time. I know I destroyed your trust, your financial security, maybe your whole life. I'm going to prison regardless of any deal. But I can help you get out from under this debt. I can give them everything about the network, the offshore accounts where they moved money, the other victims I know about. Maybe it's not enough, but it's all I have. Over the next 4 hours, with prosecutors and FBI agents recording everything, Marcus detailed the fraud operation with painful precision. He named names, described recruitment tactics, explained how Prestige Capital Solutions structured loans to maximize profit while appearing legitimate. He revealed that some of the collection agencies purchasing the defaulted loans were actually owned by the same criminal network, creating a closed loop of profit. Most importantly for my situation, he provided evidence that Jeffrey Brennan had explicitly told him to mislead me about the nature of my liability as co-signer. Documentation that the loan was structured to fail from the beginning, designed specifically to trap co-signers like me in unpayable debt. When the session concluded, Marcus looked at me one last time. I know saying I'm sorry is meaningless, but for what it's worth I am. You deserved better than a brother like me. I stood to leave without responding. At the door I paused and looked back. You're right. I did deserve better. I deserved the brother I thought you were. The one who didn't exist. The information Marcus provided accelerated the federal case significantly. Within 6 weeks, prosecutors had arrested 8 additional people connected to the fraud network, including several offshore account managers who'd helped hide the stolen money. More importantly for victims like me, they'd traced substantial assets that could potentially be recovered. This is the best case scenario we could have hoped for, Susan Ortega told me during an update meeting. With Marcus's cooperation and the asset discovery, we can file a motion to void your loan entirely based on fraud in the inducement. The evidence that you were deliberately deceived about the nature of your obligation is overwhelming. How long until we know? I asked, afraid to hope too much. The criminal trial is scheduled for 6 months from now. Assuming convictions, we can file our civil motion immediately after. Call it 9 months to a year before resolution. 9 months to a year. I'd already lived with this nightmare for 14 months. I could survive another year if it meant eventual freedom. The trial, when it finally happened, was everything the prosecutors had promised. Marcus testified for the government as part of his plea deal, detailing the fraud operation with devastating specificity. Jeffrey Brennan's defense tried to paint him as just a loan officer following company policy, but the evidence of deliberate deception was overwhelming. I testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through my experience from Marcus's initial text message to the moment I'd realized the trap I was in. I described the deliberate misleading statements Brennan had made, the paperwork that obscured rather than clarified my obligations, the financial devastation that had followed. Did you understand that you were personally guaranteeing a $240,000 loan when you signed those documents? The prosecutor asked. No, I replied clearly. I was explicitly told I was signing a symbolic co-signer document, that the business would be responsible for all payments, and that I would not be personally liable. The defense attorney tried to shake my testimony on cross-examination, suggesting I hadn't read the documents carefully or had chosen to believe what I wanted to hear. But the recordings of Brennan's misleading statements, combined with Marcus's testimony about the deliberate deception, made their case weak. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for Jeffrey Brennan and 3 Prestige Capital Solutions executives. Marcus, having already pled guilty, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Brennan received 15 years. Standing outside the courthouse after the verdicts were read, surrounded by Rachel, Susan, Sharon, and Patricia, I felt something I hadn't experienced in nearly 2 years, hope. This is just the beginning, Susan reminded us. Now comes the civil work to actually void these loans and recover damages. But it was a beginning. After so long feeling helpless and trapped, we'd fought back and won. The civil proceedings moved more quickly than expected. Armed with the criminal convictions and evidence of fraud, Susan filed motions to void my loan and the loans of the other victim co-signers. Retrieval Financial Services, facing their own potential fraud charges for their role in the scheme, settled rather than fight. 18 months after that midnight text message from Marcus, I received a letter from the court. My loan obligation was voided entirely. Not reduced, not restructured. Voided. As if it had never existed. I sat on my couch, reading the legal document through tears of relief and rage and grief for everything I'd lost. The money I'd spent fighting this. The sleep I'd lost. The relationships that had suffered while I was consumed by financial crisis. The trust I'd had in family that Marcus had destroyed. But I'd survived. More than survived. I'd fought back and won. Rachel called that evening. I heard about your ruling. Congratulations. Thank you for everything, I said, meaning it deeply. I wouldn't have gotten through this without you. Actually, I was calling about something else, Rachel continued. Several of us who worked on this case want to start a nonprofit focused on helping co-signer fraud victims. Education, legal resources, support networks. We'd like you to be involved. I thought about Sharon and Patricia, about the other victims I'd met through this process, about how isolated and helpless I'd felt before finding them, before understanding I wasn't alone in what had happened. Yes, I said without hesitation. Absolutely yes. The Charlotte Community Foundation conference room felt sterile and official, nothing like the warm vision I'd imagined when Rachel first proposed starting a nonprofit dedicated to helping co-signer fraud victims. 6 months had passed since my loan was voided. 6 months of slowly rebuilding my financial life while working with Rachel, Susan Ortega, and 2 other attorneys who'd handled similar fraud cases. Now we sat around a long table covered in incorporation documents, bylaws, and mission statements, trying to transform our shared outrage into something constructive. We need a name that clearly communicates our purpose without being too narrow, said Michael Torres, one of the attorneys who joined our organizing committee. He'd represented 3 victims in civil cases against Prestige Capital Solutions and had become passionate about prevention and education. Something that speaks to the specific issue but doesn't limit us to just co-signer situations. What about financial family fraud prevention? Suggested Patricia Chun, who'd become increasingly involved as she worked through her own recovery from the nephew who disappeared with her life savings. She'd taken early retirement from her accounting firm to dedicate herself to this work full-time. Sharon Delgado shook her head. Too corporate sounding. We need something that feels accessible, that makes people feel like they can reach out without shame. Sharon had become our informal counselor for new victims, having a gift for making people feel heard and understood, rather than judged for trusting family members who'd betrayed them. We debated for another hour before Rachel suggested simply, the Guardian Project. Because we're helping people guard against fraud, but also because we're creating a community of guardians who look out for each other. The name felt right immediately. We voted unanimously to adopt it. Over the following months, the Guardian Project took shape in ways both exciting and overwhelming. We secured our nonprofit status, set up a website, and created educational materials about co-signer fraud and financial manipulation tactics. But the real work happened in the dozens of calls we started receiving from people trapped in situations eerily similar to mine. My daughter needed help with student loans, a woman named Beverly from Greensboro told me during one of my first intake calls. Her voice shook with a mixture of anger and shame. Private loans, she said. I co-signed because she's my baby because I wanted her to get her degree. Now she's dropped out, moved to California with her boyfriend, and I'm getting calls saying I owe $130,000. How did I not see this coming? I recognized every emotion in her voice because I'd felt them all myself. You didn't see it coming because you were supposed to be trusting your daughter, I told her gently. That's not a flaw in you. That's someone exploiting what should be a healthy relationship. We connected Beverly with one of our volunteer attorneys who reviewed her loan documents. Within a week, they discovered irregularities similar to those in the Prestige Capital Solutions cases. The loan company had misrepresented terms, buried critical information in dense legal language, and structured payments to maximize long-term profit. We were building another case. The calls kept coming. A father whose son had needed bail money that turned into a predatory loan. A grandmother who'd co-signed for a grandchild's car that was immediately sold, leaving her with payments on a vehicle she'd never seen. A woman who'd helped her sister get a business loan, only to discover the business was fictitious and her sister had disappeared. Each story cut into me because I understood exactly how it felt. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was emotional, familial, striking at the core of what family was supposed to mean. These weren't strangers who'd defrauded us. They were people we'd loved, trusted, helped raise or been raised by. 3 months into the Guardian Project's operation, I was working my regular nursing shift when I got a call from Rachel during my break. You need to see this, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. I'm sending you a link. The article was from a financial news website. New lending platform promises revolutionary co-signer protections. I scanned the piece, my stomach sinking with each paragraph. A company called Silverline Financial was launching what they described as an innovative lending model specifically designed to protect co-signers through smart contracts and automated safeguards. Look at who's listed as their compliance director, Rachel said. I scrolled to the management team photos. There, with a new haircut and expensive suit, was Jeffrey Brennan. Using his middle name, Reese, and claiming extensive experience in consumer lending reform. How is this possible? I demanded. He was convicted of fraud. He's supposed to be in prison for 15 years. His appeal succeeded on a technicality, Rachel explained, fury evident beneath her professional tone. Something about evidence handling during the investigation. He got out on a reduced sentence 3 months ago. Apparently, he's been quietly rebuilding his reputation, positioning himself as someone who learned from past mistakes. I stared at Brennan's photo, remembering his smooth assurances in that conference room, the way he'd made fraud sound like standard business practice. Now he was back, selling himself as a reformed expert, ready to defraud a new generation of victims with different packaging. We need to expose this, I said. Agreed. But carefully. If we go public without solid evidence that Silverline is actually fraudulent, they'll sue us for defamation and potentially destroy the Guardian Project before we've even established ourselves. Over the next several weeks, we investigated Silverline Financial with the intensity of people who knew exactly what to look for. Michael Torres examined their loan documents and found concerning clauses buried in the fine print. Rachel contacted her sources in financial regulation and discovered that several watchdog groups had already flagged Silverline's practices as potentially predatory. Patricia used her accounting expertise to analyze their financial disclosures and found inconsistencies that suggested money was being moved in ways designed to obscure the actual loan terms and costs. Most damning, we found the beginning of a victim pattern. 3 people had already contacted consumer protection agencies complaining that Silverline's revolutionary cosigner protections had failed to activate when borrowers defaulted, leaving cosigners fully liable despite promises to the contrary. It's the same scheme with different branding, Susan Ortega concluded after reviewing our findings. Brennan learned from getting caught. He's made the fraud more sophisticated, harder to prove, but it's fundamentally the same predatory model. We compiled our evidence into a comprehensive report and sent it simultaneously to the North Carolina Attorney General's office, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and 3 investigative journalists known for covering financial fraud. Then we published our own analysis on the Guardian Project website, carefully worded to avoid defamation claims while making our concerns clear. The response was immediate and intense. Silverline Financial issued a statement calling our allegations baseless attacks from disgruntled individuals with personal vendettas. Brennan himself appeared in a video statement, presenting himself as a reformed professional being unfairly targeted by people who didn't understand the complexity of modern lending. I made mistakes in the past which I deeply regret, he said, his expression carefully calibrated to project sincerity. But I've spent years learning, growing, and developing new approaches that actually protect consumers. These attacks are coming from people who would rather destroy than allow for redemption and positive change. The performance was masterful and I hated how effective it was. Comments on the video split between people calling him a con artist and others praising his willingness to acknowledge past errors and move forward. Then one of the journalists we contacted published an investigative piece that changed everything. She'd found 4 additional Silverline victims beyond the 3 we'd identified, interviewed them extensively, and obtained internal communications showing that Brennan had explicitly modeled Silverline's loan structure on the Prestige Capital Solutions approach, just with additional legal protections to make prosecution more difficult. The article went viral. Within 48 hours, Silverline Financial's website was down, their social media accounts disabled. State regulators announced investigations. And Brennan disappeared again, his location unknown. He'll resurface, Rachel predicted during an emergency Guardian Project meeting. People like him always do. Different name, different state, same fundamental scheme. Then we need to be ready, I said. We need to build something permanent that outlasts any individual case or criminal. A resource that helps people recognize these patterns regardless of what company name or which smooth-talking loan officer is selling it. That conversation led to our most ambitious project yet: a comprehensive database and early warning system. We created detailed profiles of known fraudulent lenders, identified red flags in loan documentation, and built a network of financial professionals, attorneys, and fraud investigators who could quickly evaluate suspicious situations. We also started conducting workshops specifically targeting the populations most vulnerable to cosigner fraud. Community centers in lower-income neighborhoods where family members often relied on each other for financial help. College campuses where students might pressure parents into risky cosigning. Senior centers where grandparents could be exploited by grandchildren needing money. I found myself becoming a public speaker, something that would have terrified me 2 years earlier. But standing in front of groups of people, sharing my story and watching recognition dawn in their eyes, I discovered a sense of purpose I'd never experienced in my nursing career. I was a nurse for 15 years. I would begin each presentation. I was trained to spot warning signs, to question, to verify. But when my brother asked me to co-sign a loan, I ignored every instinct that told me something was wrong. Not because I was stupid, but because he knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. Family, trust, loyalty. The manipulators are experts at weaponizing our best qualities against us. After one presentation at a community center in Durham, an older woman approached me with tears streaming down her face. "My grandson asked me to co-sign last week," she said. "I was planning to do it tomorrow. But everything you described, the pressure, the urgency, the promises that I wouldn't really be responsible, it's exactly what he's been saying." I spent an hour with her, reviewing the loan documents her grandson had given her. The company wasn't Prestige Capital Solutions or Silverline Financial, but the structure was identical. Buried clauses that made the cosigner fully liable. Terms that made early repayment prohibitively expensive. Language designed to obscure rather than clarify actual obligations. "What should I do?" she asked. "He's my grandson. If I say no, he'll think I don't trust him." "That's exactly what they're counting on," I told her gently. "The fear that saying no means you don't love or trust your family member. But real love doesn't manipulate. Real trust doesn't require you to risk your financial security without fully understanding what you're signing." She decided not to co-sign. Her grandson was furious, accused her of ruining his life, stopped taking her calls. 2 months later, she contacted me again. The loan company had been shut down by federal regulators for fraud. Her grandson had been one of dozens of recruiters being paid to bring in co-signers who would be trapped with unpayable debt. "You saved me," she said. "I would have lost everything." Stories like hers kept me going through the exhausting work of building the Guardian Project. We were operating on minimal funding, mostly grants and donations, with everyone volunteering significant time beyond their regular jobs. I was still working full-time at the hospital, doing Guardian Project work during my off hours, sleeping less than I should. But we were making a difference. By the end of our first year, we'd helped 43 people avoid predatory co-signing situations and assisted 17 victims in voiding fraudulent loans. We'd contributed to regulatory actions against 3 lending companies and helped law enforcement build cases against 5 individuals running cosigner fraud schemes. The work took a toll, though. Constantly immersing myself in stories of financial betrayal, reliving my own trauma through others' experiences, it wore on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I started having nightmares about collection calls, waking up in a panic thinking I'd somehow missed a payment on a debt that no longer existed. My nursing supervisor pulled me aside after I made a medication error, something I'd never done in 15 years of practice. "Elena, you're burning out. I can see it. Whatever you're dealing with outside of work, you need to address it before it impacts patient care." She was right. I'd been so focused on helping others that I'd neglected my own healing. The loan might be voided, but the emotional damage from Marcus's betrayal remained unprocessed. I channeled my pain into activism, which was valuable, but it wasn't the same as actually dealing with the trauma. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in financial abuse and family betrayal. Dr. Sarah Fieldstone was in her 50s, with a calm presence that made it easier to discuss painful topics. "You've done remarkable work transforming your experience into help for others," she observed during one of our early sessions. "But I notice you haven't yet allowed yourself to fully grieve what you lost. The brother you thought you had. The trust that was broken. The 2 years of your life consumed by this crisis. She was right. I'd been so busy fighting, surviving, building something constructive from destruction, that I hadn't let myself simply feel the loss. When I finally did, in the safety of her office, the grief was overwhelming. I cried for the Marcus I'd thought existed, the little brother I protected and supported. I cried for my own naivety, for the financial security I'd worked so hard to build and had seen destroyed. I cried for all the victims I was trying to help, carrying their stories alongside my own. The work you're doing is important, Dr. Fieldstone said. But it can't be your only identity. You're not just a fraud victim or a fraud fighter. You're Elena, a nurse, a friend, a person with interests and needs beyond this mission. Taking her advice seriously, I started setting boundaries. I limited my Guardian Project work to specific days and hours, protecting my off time for actual rest and recovery. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the crisis, went hiking again, even started dating cautiously, though trust remained difficult. I also made the decision to write about my experience, not as an academic analysis or legal document, but as a personal narrative. A cautionary tale, yes, but also a story of survival and transformation. I wanted other victims to see themselves in my story and understand they weren't alone or stupid or irredeemably damaged by what had happened to them. The article I wrote was published in a national magazine focused on personal finance and consumer protection. I used my full name, shared specific details of my experience, and included photos from before and after the fraud. The vulnerability felt terrifying but also liberating. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours of publication, the Guardian Project website crashed from traffic. Our email inbox filled with hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories, asking for help, expressing gratitude that someone understood what they were experiencing. We had to rapidly scale up our operations, bringing on additional volunteer attorneys and counselors to handle the influx of cases. What had started as a small nonprofit run by a handful of passionate individuals was evolving into something much larger. Media outlets started requesting interviews. I appeared on local news programs, then regional, then national. Each appearance brought more attention to the issue of cosigner fraud and more people seeking help. It was during one of these media appearances, a segment on a morning talk show, that something unexpected happened. I was in the green room waiting to go on when another guest approached me. He was about my age, professionally dressed, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. "Ms. Vasquez? I'm Daniel Reeves. I'm actually here to talk about my new book on financial literacy, but I wanted to tell you how much I admire the work you're doing. My sister was nearly victimized by a cosigner scheme last year. She reached out to the Guardian Project, and you probably saved her from financial ruin." We talked for several minutes before both being called for our segments. He gave me his card, suggesting we stay in touch since our work overlapped in areas of financial education and consumer protection. Over the following months, Daniel and I developed a professional friendship that slowly became personal. He understood the mission that drove me without needing extensive explanation. He'd seen his own family nearly torn apart by financial manipulation. We collaborated on several educational projects, combining his expertise in financial literacy with the Guardian Project's focus on fraud prevention. "You know what I find most impressive about you?" Daniel said during one of our working dinners that had become increasingly common. "You took something that could have destroyed you and transformed it into something that helps thousands of people. That takes incredible strength." I appreciated the recognition, but I also felt the need to be honest. Most days it doesn't feel like strength. Feels like stubbornness. Refusing to let Marcus and Brennan, and everyone involved in that scheme win by destroying me. "Maybe stubbornness is just another word for resilience," he suggested with a smile. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully, both of us aware of the trust issues I carried from my experience. Daniel was patient, never pushing, always respectful of my boundaries. When I finally told him the full story of Marcus's betrayal, including details I hadn't shared publicly, he listened without judgment. "Do you ever hear from him?" Daniel asked. "Your brother. He writes sometimes. Letters from prison. Apologies that feel hollow because they can't undo what he did. Last month he sent one saying he understands if I never forgive him, but he hopes someday I'll believe that he really did love me, that his actions came from desperation rather than malice. Do you believe that? I considered the question carefully. I believe he might have convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't really going to hurt me. People are remarkably good at justifying their actions, especially when there's money involved. But his intentions matter less than the impact. He made choices that devastated my life. Repeatedly. Deliberately. Whatever love he might have felt didn't stop him from doing that. Are you going to respond to his letters? No. There's nothing more to say. He's living with his consequences and I'm living with mine. The difference is I'm building something meaningful from the wreckage, while he's just serving time. The second anniversary of my loan signing passed with a strange mixture of pain and pride. 2 years since that midnight text message from Marcus. 2 years since I walked into that gleaming office building and signed away my financial security. The date had once represented the beginning of my nightmare. Now it marked how far I'd come. The Guardian Project held a small celebration at our newly opened physical office space, a modest suite in a Charlotte office building funded by a grant from a foundation focused on consumer protection. We'd grown to include 3 full-time staff members, a dozen regular volunteers, and partnerships with legal aid organizations across 3 states. 2 years and 93 families helped, Rachel said, raising a glass of champagne. That's 93 people who won't go through what we went through. That's a legacy worth celebrating. I looked around the office at the team we'd built, the resources we'd created, the impact we were having. Marcus had tried to destroy me for $40,000. Instead, he'd inadvertently launched something that was destroying the fraudulent systems that had enabled him. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, the old panic flared, memories of collection calls and threatening messages. But when I checked, it was from Beverly, the woman from Greensboro who'd been one of our early cases. 1 year since my loan was voided thanks to you. My daughter and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship. It's hard, but we're trying. Thank you for showing me that being victimized doesn't mean being broken. I showed the message to Rachel, who smiled. This is why we do it. Not just the legal victories, but the healing that follows. The celebration continued around me, but I stepped out onto the small balcony attached to our office, looking out at the Charlotte skyline. Somewhere in this city was the Prestige Capital Solutions building, now empty and for lease after the company's collapse. Somewhere in the federal prison system was Marcus serving his sentence. Somewhere, probably planning his next scheme, was Jeffrey Brennan. But here, in this moment, was me. Survivor. Advocate. Builder of something meaningful from ashes. The fraud had taken 2 years of my life, had cost me more than money, had broken something fundamental about how I understood family and trust. But it hadn't destroyed me. And if I had my way, the systems and people who preyed on others' trust would find it increasingly difficult to operate. One case at a time, one prevented victim at a time, one fraudulent lender shut down at a time. My nursing supervisor had been right about burnout, and my therapist had been right about needing life beyond the mission. But the mission remained essential. It was just part of my life now, not the entirety of it. Daniel joined me on the balcony, handing me a fresh glass of champagne. You look contemplative. Just thinking about how strange life is. 2 years ago I was drowning. Now I'm helping others stay afloat. More than that, he corrected gently. You're teaching them to swim. There's a difference. The sun was setting over Charlotte, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Beautiful despite everything. Maybe even beautiful because of everything. The darkness I'd walked through had given me the ability to see light more clearly, to appreciate what I'd rebuilt with deeper understanding than I'd had before. Inside, someone called my name. Another case that needed attention, another person reaching out for help. I took a breath, squeezed Daniel's hand, and went back to work. The fight against financial fraud was far from over. But tonight, surrounded by people who understood and supported this mission, I felt ready for whatever came next. The collection agency letters I'd once dreaded had been replaced by thank you notes from people we'd helped. The sleepless nights of panic had evolved into sleepless nights of purpose. And the brother who'd betrayed me had inadvertently given me something he never intended. A calling that transformed my pain into protection for others. That was victory enough for now. The phone call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, while I was restocking medication carts at the hospital. 3 years had passed since Marcus's betrayal, and the Guardian Project had become an established force in consumer protection advocacy. I'd learned to recognize the specific hesitation in someone's voice when they were calling about a family member who'd asked them to co-sign something suspicious. But this call was different. Elena Vasquez? The voice was unfamiliar, male with a slight tremor of nervousness. My name is Christopher Brennan. I'm Jeffrey Brennan's son. I stopped moving, my hand frozen on a medication bottle. I have nothing to say to anyone connected to your father. Please, just 2 minutes. I'm not calling to defend him or ask for anything. I'm calling because I need to warn you. My father is being released from prison next month. Early release for good behavior. And he's been talking about you. Every protective instinct activated. Talking about me, how? He blames you for destroying his reputation, for the criminal conviction, for everything. He's convinced himself that if you hadn't started the Guardian Project and exposed Silverline Financial, he'd still be successful. I've tried to reason with him, but he's obsessed. I thought you should know. After the call ended, I immediately contacted Rachel and Susan. We filed for a restraining order, alerted law enforcement, and increased security protocols at the Guardian Project office. But knowing Jeffrey Brennan was being released, knowing he harbored resentment toward me, created a constant low-level anxiety I couldn't shake. Daniel noticed my tension during one of our now regular dinners at my townhouse. We'd been officially together for 8 months, taking things slowly, building trust brick by careful brick. You're worried about Brennan getting out, he observed, not a question. I keep thinking about all the victims he created, how many lives he destroyed for profit. And now he gets to walk free after serving less than half his sentence. I set down my wine glass with more force than intended. It feels like the system failed us all over again. The system did fail, Daniel agreed. But you didn't. The Guardian Project exists because you refused to let that failure be the end of the story. Brennan being released doesn't erase what you've built. His words were logical, but fear doesn't respond to logic. For weeks after Christopher's warning, I found myself looking over my shoulder, checking locks obsessively, startling at unexpected sounds. Then Brennan did something I never anticipated. He wrote me a letter. The envelope arrived at the Guardian Project office, forwarded through his attorney. Inside was 3 pages of careful handwriting that managed to be both apologetic and self-justifying in equal measure. Ms. Vasquez, I understand you have no reason to trust anything I say. I've spent considerable time in prison reflecting on the choices that brought me here. I cannot undo the harm I caused you and others. What I can offer is information that might help prevent future fraud schemes. The letter went on to detail several emerging fraud patterns he'd observed or heard about from other inmates in the white-collar criminal unit where he'd been housed. New variations on co-signing schemes, cryptocurrency scams targeting family relationships, elaborate catfishing operations designed to manipulate people into financial crimes. I don't expect forgiveness, the letter concluded, but perhaps I can provide intelligence that serves your mission. Consider this an attempt at restitution, however inadequate. I brought the letter to our weekly Guardian Project strategy meeting. The team's reactions ranged from Rachel's immediate suspicion to Patricia's cautious interest in the tactical information he'd provided. It could be genuine, Michael Torres suggested. Some people do experience authentic transformation in prison. The question is whether we can verify the information without engaging directly with someone we have every reason to distrust. Susan's legal perspective was characteristically pragmatic. Take the information, verify it independently, use what's valuable, and maintain clear boundaries. His motivations don't matter if the intelligence helps protect potential victims. We implemented exactly that approach. The fraud patterns Brennan described checked out when we investigated them independently. We incorporated warnings about these new schemes into our educational materials without acknowledging the source. When Brennan sent a follow-up letter asking if the information had been useful, I didn't respond. 6 months after his release, Brennan did something that made national news. He approached federal prosecutors with detailed information about a massive fraud network operating across 12 states, offering to testify in exchange for no additional prosecution. The network he exposed had stolen over $300 million through various family-targeting financial schemes. The media coverage was extensive and divided. Some outlets praised his cooperation and presented him as an example of criminal rehabilitation. Others, including several pieces featuring interviews with his victims, argued that cooperation didn't erase past harm and questioned whether someone who'd built a career on fraud could ever be truly trustworthy. I declined all media requests for comment. My focus remained on the Guardian Project's work, which had expanded significantly. We now operated in 7 states, had helped over 400 families, and had contributed to legislative changes that strengthened cosigner protections and increased penalties for financial fraud targeting family relationships. The real transformation came not from Brennan's supposed redemption or Marcus's imprisonment, but from the community of survivors we'd built. People like Sharon, who'd become a certified financial counselor specifically to help fraud victims. Like Patricia, whose accounting expertise had been instrumental in unraveling complex fraudulent loan structures. Like Beverly, who now volunteered to counsel families navigating the aftermath of financial betrayal. On the 4th anniversary of my loan signing, the Guardian Project hosted our largest event yet, a national conference on family financial fraud. Over 300 attendees including victims, advocates, attorneys, law enforcement, and legislators gathered to share knowledge and coordinate efforts. I stood backstage before my keynote speech, reviewing my notes but mostly thinking about the journey that had brought me here. The midnight text from Marcus felt like something from another lifetime, a moment that had divided my existence into before and after. Daniel found me in the wings, adjusting his tie. He was speaking on a panel about financial literacy education as fraud prevention. Ready to inspire 300 people with your story of turning catastrophe into purpose? I'm ready to tell them the truth, I replied. That surviving fraud doesn't mean you stop being angry or hurt. It means you find ways to make the anger productive and the hurt meaningful. It means you refuse to let what happened to you happen to others if you can prevent it. My speech focused not on the sensational details of my case, but on the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding after financial devastation. The boring parts that nobody dramatizes. Learning to trust again, setting healthy boundaries, asking for help, accepting that healing isn't linear. Some of you came here hoping I'd tell you it gets completely better, I said, scanning the audience of faces that reflected every stage of the recovery process. That one day you wake up and the betrayal doesn't hurt anymore. That the financial stress disappears, that everything returns to normal. But here's what I've learned. It doesn't go back to normal. You build a new normal. And sometimes, if you're lucky and you work hard and you find the right support, that new normal is actually better than what you had before. Not because the fraud was good, but because you discovered strengths you didn't know you possessed. The standing ovation that followed felt less like applause for me specifically and more like recognition of our collective resilience. Every person in that room carried their own story of betrayal and survival. Together, we were building something larger than individual healing. We were creating systems and resources and communities that would outlast all of us. During the reception afterward, a young woman approached me nervously. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark circles under her eyes that I recognized from my own mirror in the worst days. My mom asked me to co-sign for her boyfriend last week, she said quietly. I came to this conference trying to decide if I should do it. After your speech, I know the answer. Thank you for giving me permission to say no without feeling guilty. These moments, more than any media coverage or legal victory, reminded me why the work mattered. That evening, Daniel and I sat on my townhouse patio, comfortable in the silence that comes from truly knowing someone. The Charlotte skyline glittered in the distance, the same view I'd had 4 years ago when my world was collapsing. I got an interesting call today, Daniel said carefully. A publisher who heard my conference panel wants me to write a book on financial literacy. They suggested I co-author it with someone who has direct experience with fraud recovery. They specifically mentioned you. I considered the proposal. Writing my magazine article had been therapeutic and impactful. A full book would require deeper excavation of painful memories, but it would also reach people our current resources couldn't access. Let's do it, I decided. But with one condition. A portion of proceeds goes to the Guardian Project. And we interview other victims, make it clear this isn't just my story but a collective experience. The book project consumed our spare time for the next 8 months. We interviewed 50 fraud victims, synthesizing their experiences with practical financial education and recovery strategies. The process was emotionally exhausting but ultimately affirming. Every person we spoke with had transformed their pain into purpose in different ways. When the book was published 18 months later under the title Beyond Betrayal, Rebuilding After Financial Fraud, it became an unexpected success. Not a bestseller but a steady seller, the kind of book people bought for themselves or loved ones facing similar situations, that lived on resource lists and support group recommendations. More importantly, it created another avenue for people to find help. Our Guardian Project contact information was prominently featured, resulting in a new wave of victims reaching out for assistance. I finally responded to one of Marcus's letters, not to forgive or reconcile, but to provide closure. Marcus, I received your latest letter asking if I think you're a good person who made bad choices or a bad person who occasionally did good things. I've spent 4 years working through the damage you caused, and here's what I've concluded. It doesn't matter. The categories of good and bad are less important than the choices we make and their impact on others. You made choices that devastated me and profited from my trust. I've made choices to transform that devastation into protection for others. We're both living with the consequences of our decisions. I don't hate you anymore, but I don't need you in my life either. This will be my last letter. I hope you find peace with yourself, but you'll have to do it without my participation. Sending that letter felt like releasing weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The need for Marcus to understand what he'd done, to truly acknowledge the harm, to somehow make it right, letting go of those needs was its own kind of freedom. 5 years after the midnight text that changed everything, I stood in front of a mirror in a boutique dress shop. Daniel waited outside while I tried on wedding dresses, accompanied by Rachel and Sharon. We'd gotten engaged 3 months earlier, a quiet proposal during a hiking trip that felt perfectly us. What do you think of this one? I asked, turning to show them a simple ivory dress, elegant without being ostentatious. It's beautiful, Rachel said, her eyes suspiciously shiny. You look happy. Genuinely happy. I studied my reflection, thinking about the woman I'd been 5 years ago. She'd been confident in her financial stability and her family relationships. She trusted easily, believed the best of people, especially those she loved. The fraud had shattered that version of myself. The woman looking back at me now was different. More cautious, yes, but also stronger. More aware of how people could manipulate trust, but also more appreciative of genuine trustworthiness. She'd built something meaningful from destruction. She'd learned that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story, just an incredibly difficult middle chapter. I am happy, I confirmed, surprising myself with how true it was. The wedding was small and intimate, nothing like the elaborate affair Olivia had almost had in the inspirational story that had first taught me about transformation after crisis. Just close friends, chosen family, people who'd been there through the worst and celebrated reaching the best. During our vows, I promised Daniel honesty, patience, and the continued work of learning to trust fully again. He promised me safety, support, and understanding that healing doesn't have a finish line. At the reception, surrounded by Guardian Project team members and the community we'd built, I felt the truth of what I'd told that conference audience. Life hadn't returned to normal. We'd built something better than normal. Something forged in crisis, strengthened through adversity, and dedicated to ensuring others wouldn't face the same battles alone. Marcus remained in prison. Jeffrey Brennan continued his complicated performance of redemption. The fraud schemes evolved, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation. But the Guardian Project stood as a bulwark against predatory lending, a resource for victims, and a testament to the possibility of transformation. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. For just a moment, old fear flickered. Then I read the message. You helped my sister 3 years ago. Today she bought her first house. Thank you for giving our family a second chance. I showed it to Daniel, who kissed my temple and whispered, "This is your real legacy. Not just surviving, but making survival possible for others." He was right. The collection agency had come knocking 5 years ago, threatening to destroy everything I'd built. Instead, I'd learned to build differently, stronger, with foundations that couldn't be shaken by betrayal or fraud or fear. The formality Marcus had promised turned out to be the beginning of the most transformative period of my life. Not the transformation he'd planned, where I took the fall for his schemes, but a transformation into someone who refused to be destroyed, who turned victimhood into advocacy, who proved that the most powerful response to betrayal is refusing to let it define you. That was the story I'd tell, the legacy I'd build, and the future I'd create. One protected family at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.